Hello and welcome to My Friend the Rainbow Circle. As I said in a previous episode, I'm trying to um, write my own Toni Morrison novel. And so I'm doing deep dive and studying, trying to figure out how she does what she does. And I'm about to start home. I have the audiobook here. Part of the problem with the audiobook, that's how I read anything anymore. But part of the problem with the audiobook is pulling quotes. I can really, consciously recognize, sentence structures. And sometimes I get caught up in those so much that I miss things like plot. So two of the main areas that I'm really trying to study to figure out how Toni Morrison writes her novels. Plot, I talked about that last time. She has this really organic sort of a plot, not, your traditional Fry Talk sort of triangle, but things just cropping up really organically within a setting. So she has this setting, and she has these multiple episodic interactions between usually two characters, two or three characters, that sort of thing. But the prose is the part that's really what she's known for, and so pulling quotes from an audiobook is a little bit of a challenge, just in the way I framed this project, semi-arbitrarily the way I framed this project. So I came up with the idea to pull quotes from Goodreads, which is has some value because it shows how many likes certain quotes get. It has limited value. This is not really a scientific sort of a study. It has very limited value, but it makes for an interesting study because you can compare side by side within the context of this particular way of pulling quotes. Which ones of these are most liked by this particular audience, the Goodreads audience. So there's a limited amount of value to it. It's an interesting way to look at it, but it's not ultimately the most revelatory thing necessarily. However, the unintended consequence, I was just diving into this to see, just to figure out how Toni Morrison's prose works. But in Unintended Consequences, a demonstration of why a lot of the so-called rules of creative writing textbooks and classes and things like that don't really hold much water. Because if you think of the prose rules, rules, deep quotes on that, that you hear a lot in creative writing textbooks and classes and what have you. You'll hear things like show, don't tell. Well, show, don't tell, Toni Morrison doesn't really follow that. Avoid adverbs. She uses a lot of adverbs. Avoid words with no concrete visual resonance. She uses tons of those, so abstracts. That's sort of the significance of the show, don't tell. Avoid abstraction. She uses tons of abstractions. And one of the things that frustrated me about, many things frustrated me about what I was being taught by creative writing classes and textbooks and things like that was, how many of these false universals really didn't actually apply to a lot of the good prose that I really enjoyed. So there was a lot of emphasis on efficiency, and they would reference Hemingway and Raymond Carver as if Hemingway and Raymond Carver's prose was the only type of prose that you could use. And Hemingway and Raymond Carver's prose is efficient, supposedly. I think that's a bit overblown, but it's efficient in the sense that it eliminates unnecessary words, supposedly. It shortens the sentences, it gets rid of conjunctions. I would think efficiency would get rid of repetition, but Ernest Hemingway and Raymond Carver are extremely repetitious. So, that's a bit of nonsense. There was so little emphasis on things like rhythm. It was all emphasis on just word choice and efficiency, concrete images, efficiently structured. That's not really a rule. That's just one of the ways that you can go about it. If you're a big fan of Ernest Hemingway and Raymond Carver, go about it the same way they do. But I think when it comes to beautiful prose, rhythm is one of the biggest parts of it. So there's a whole wide variety of different structures that you could use. So just listening to, binging all the Toni Morrison that I've been doing lately, it reminded me, sort of the theory I had in responding to this overemphasis on the Ernest Hemingway, Raymond Carver style is a lot of the professors who championed that were from the North. This is a simplification, but they were from the North. They were teaching in North Carolina, but they were from the North. So sort of my simplification inside my head, I know this is entirely inaccurate. I did a whole video on inaccurate false dualisms. But this is just a simplification that I had. So that sort of short, quote-unquote, efficient prose that de-emphasizes complicated sentences and de-emphasizes conjunctions. I had so many people just cut out my conjunctions. I love conjunctions. I called that the northern style, and heavy emphasis on more complicated sentences with lots of conjunctions. I call that the southern style. So my way of really simplifying and processing this sort of recommendation with prose was that the longer, more complicated sentences, that's the southern style. The shorter sentences, eliminating conjunctions, things like that, that's the northern style. Toni Morrison is from Ohio, and so I got the impression that she was using more of a southern style and just, trying to figure out what she was doing. I thought maybe she was influenced, both her parents are from the South, maybe she was influenced by that. So that was sort of the idea, just jumping right into it, that was sort of the idea that I was working with, is that her prose style is more influenced by that sort of southern way of speaking. Don't know if that's really true or not. I don't have quite a proof yet, but that's sort of the first thesis of the project. She did her thesis on Faulkner and Virginia Woolf, and Faulkner, of course, very famously has the definition of that southern style. And Virginia Woolf, she has a British style, but she has very florid, sort of highly descriptive prose. Part of the issue with trying to figure out how prose works is I'm highly synesthetic, so I can picture the structure of a sentence by visuals. So usually more abstract sort of the language will have a certain color and texture, where more concrete language will have a certain color and texture. More abstract language would be more fluid, more of a washed out sort of a color. More concrete language will be more solid, obviously, with a deeper sort of a color. So, listening to Toni Morrison, the way I process that information, her synesthetically, her prose was very similar to Virginia Woolf's prose. It would sort of start off with the looser sort of washed out color and solidify towards the end. It was very anaphoric. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that word. She uses a lot of anaphora. That's a word that I've read a lot, but I've never really heard anyone pronounce it. She uses a lot of anaphora, and so sort of my secondary theory, I'm not sure that the theory that she's using very southern sort of structures in her sentences is necessarily pans out, but she's using sort of a biblical prose, which is an interesting sort of prose style that you do see really, really commonly. I think Faulkner is really using a lot of that sort of biblical style, anaphora heavy, full of aphorisms, full of truisms and things like that, which are abstraction. So if you say show don't tell, that sort of biblical style is a lot of telling. So it'd be anaphora heavy, a lot of telling mixed in with some showing. I mean, Toni Morrison has beautiful descriptions, and Faulkner has beautiful descriptions, but a lot of just the prose style is heavy on the telling, which really disproves the show don't tell thing completely, really. That's something that can work, but it doesn't work 100% of the time. And I think this goes back to some of the things I've been talking about. So for example, if you use the Mogon, which I say is, anytime you hear advice, you can use the Mogon to test to see if the advice really works. My banner is falling down. I just noticed my banner is falling down. I'm easily distracted. But you could use the Mogon. So the Mogon basically, if you read something and you say, that's beautiful, why is that beautiful? Why does this particular piece of prose work? And you can say it works because, let's say, it's concrete heavy, it avoids abstractions. So could you take this casuistry? It's a type of casuistry, but casuistry only really works, arguably, if you have a larger sample size, if you're really applying that to a large number of examples. So, if you say this prose really works because of show don't tell, because it uses all these concrete images, it avoids telling. And then you say, can I really apply that to all beautiful prose? Can I say all beautiful prose follows this particular rule? Well, that breaks down. That doesn't really work. And so, with the Mogon, I separate that into really three categories. One of them is just purely personal sort of things that you enjoy. One, just common things that work, common sort of practices that can work. And I would put show, don't tell in that category. And things like adverbs and things like avoiding conjunctions. I don't know why everybody hates conjunctions, but let's say avoiding conjunctions could be in that middle category. So it doesn't really elevate to the universal category, because if you take something like show don't tell and you apply it to Toni Morrison's prose, show don't tell totally fails as a universal rule. And I've been talking about this and I haven't dived into it. So I looked for the top Goodreads quotes that were over 3 lines. And so here's an example of what I was just saying. This is from Song of Solomon. This has 617 likes. It's not the top like. The top likes are in the thousands, but it's a simple one to dive into. You can't own a human being. You can't lose what you don't own. So there's that in Afra. You can't. Suppose you did own him. Could you really love somebody who was absolutely nobody without you? You really want somebody like that? Somebody who falls apart when you walk out the door? You don't, do you? And neither does he. You're turning over your life to him, your whole life, girl. So you see the repetition of words. I mean, they're abstractions. They're words like you and can't, and really, and the word love, is an abstraction. Somebody, you really want somebody like that, somebody who falls apart when you walk out the door. Walking out the door, there's a concrete image, but it's a cliche. So, there's another one of those false rules. You don't, do you? And neither does he. You're turning over your whole life to him. Your whole life. So there's that repetition. This is a dialogue. I mean, so it's, there's another issue there. And if it means so little to you that you can't, you can just give it away, hand it to him, then why should it mean any more to him? He can't value you more than you value yourself. So, one of the top liked bits of prose from Toni Morrison. Part of what skews Goodreads as a means of really diving into this sort of thing is that it tends to skew towards things that are, isolatable and function as advice, life advice and stuff like that. So that skews it. It's not perfectly objective in that way. But still, 617 people liked this, more so than other Toni Morrison quotes. Here's one that's 2,442, so it's on the upper end. The upper end ones tend to be really short. So I'm not sure what you can get necessarily from really, really short ones. Freeing yourself was one thing. Claiming ownership of that freed self was another. That's a great quote, but can you get a really good sense of, and that one has 2,571 likes. Can you get a really, can you really get a good sense of her prose style from something that short? A little bit, and still it's abstractions. It's not a whole lot of concrete language there. And still it has that biblical anaphora and parallelism. So you have sentences that repeat the structure with the same opening words. That sort of thing. That's definitely a biblical structure. But here's one. Here's one also from Song of Solomon. That's 2,442. Oh, that one line was from Beloved. It's a little bit longer. You think because he doesn't love you, I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's just you can get an idea. Similar sort of structure as the other one. You think because he doesn't love you, you are worthless. You think because he doesn't want you anymore, he is right. That his judgment and opinion of you are correct. Another thing to notice is just the frequency of the anapest. What I would call the anapest. It's hard to really call it an anapest just because it's not really in a poetic line, but it's very anapestic in iams. Anapest in iams. You think that because he doesn't want you anymore, that he is right, that his judgment and opinion of you are correct. His judgment and opinion of you are correct. There's, much more purely an anapestic line. You have a little anapest just thrown in there as that sort of rhythmic pattern, but I've collected a couple of different variations that where anapests do show up a lot. Allen Ginsberg had a lot of opinions on this. He had arguments about how iams were not necessary, and I think it was maybe Diane Trilling or somebody like that tried to argue that American cadence is naturally iambic. American and British cadence is naturally iambic, and so he disproved it. And a lot of his lines end up being iambic, but I would say really pleasing rhythm tends to be anapestic like that. I didn't call it anapestic. It's it's da 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 da. His judgment and opinion of you are correct. That's a real nice sort of rhythm. If you're doing it in prose, you wouldn't do the whole thing like that necessarily. Although I've done experiments with that plenty of times. One of my Opal Bean War stories is I'm trying to do it entirely anapestic, and it's real challenging. And another one I'm trying to do entirely iambic. It's real challenging. But you could do that. But generally, with good, beautiful prose, you'll have a whole string of these anapests, and then it'll flip it around and start going iambic. But that's the sort of thing that they never talked about in my creative writing education. It was all about the efficiency, and that's it. And this is not efficient. Toni Morrison is not, quote unquote, efficient, but that's not a problem. That's not a flaw at all. My chair's very loud. Love shouldn't be like that. So there's a short line. She has these really long lines, and then she sort of punctuates them with these little short lines. Did you ever see the way the clouds love a mountain? So here we have really concrete images. We have an anapest, nice, beautiful line there. They circle all around it. Sometimes you can't even see the mountain for the clouds. But you know what? You go up top, and what do you see? His head. The clouds never cover the head. His head pokes up through because the cloud let him. They don't wrap him up. They let him keep his head up high, free, with nothing to hide him or bind him. So with nothing to hide him or bind him. With nothing to hide him or bind him. So you have the anapest just crops up every once in a while. So you have a strong concrete image. I'm not saying, Toni Morrison uses plenty of great, beautiful, strong concrete images, but a lot of that is really abstract. So there's much more emphasis on the sort of visceral impact, the rhythm of the repetition and that sort of thing, more so than just solely isolating the visceral impact to the concrete images. But it does have that really vivid concrete image right there in the middle of this whole metaphor. But then it gets really abstract about it. You can't own a human being, you can't lose what you don't. Oh yeah, that's the one right there. So, that one was sort of separated out, and the separated one has 617. The whole one has 2,000. That's the sort of weird sort of numerical results you get from Goodreads. How do you read that? I have no idea. How do you read the conclusions out of that? I have no idea. Here's another one from Beloved. There is a loneliness that can be rocked. So it's sort of taking this abstraction of loneliness and giving it a concrete image, but it's sort of, kind of a fuzzy concrete image. It creates a visceral effect, but not necessarily that you, not necessarily that, the same way that you have the mountain and the cloud. Arms crossed, knees drawn up, holding on this motion, unlike a ship's smooth and contains the rocker. Unlike a ship's smooths and contains the rocker. It's an inside kind, wrapped tight like skin. Then there is the loneliness that roams. No rocking can hold it down. It is alive. on its own, a dry and spreading thing that makes the sound of one's own feet going seem to come from a far off place. So yeah, I mean, that's sort of taking this abstraction of loneliness and saying, here are some concrete images that sort of embody, but in a fuzzy way. I mean, how does that, it's not, if you say show, don't tell, I mean, that could be, I'll concede, you can use that as an example of show, don't tell, but you're starting with this abstract concept. Usually when people talk about show, don't tell, it's to say, somebody does an action to show that they're lonely. You don't talk about loneliness directly. But Toni Morrison is taking loneliness and giving this physicality. So sure, that's show, don't tell. So just to compare it with just to compare it with the biblical prose. Oh, where did it go? Let's see. Oh, okay. Just to compare it with biblical prose. Song of Solomon, kind of an obvious one to compare it to. Song of Solomon 5:1. I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. So one other thing that you have is appositive strings. That's something I noticed as a trend. I have a lot of things to say about appositive strings, but that is a very biblical sort of a thing to do. But I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. So to take a sentence and then add nouns trailing off the end like that, those aren't appositives necessarily, but my sister, my bride. I have gathered my myrrh along with my balsam. I have eaten my honeycomb and my honey. I have drunk my wine and my milk. Eat, friends, drink and imbibe deeply, O lovers. So, you have that in anaphora, which is very much a biblical sort of prose technique. Oh, hold on. Oh, I see what you did. Okay. So, here's another one from Song of Solomon. Oh, hold on. Oh, yeah. Let us rise early and go to the vineyards. Let us see whether the vine has budded and its blossoms have opened, and whether the pomegranates have bloomed. There I will give my love. So very concrete sort of images, but you have let us, you have that in anaphora. That's just classic biblical style, with the concrete images, for sure. But with lots and lots of abstraction, so that's sort of, here's what we shall do, and then, Song of Solomon especially uses a lot of that concrete metaphorical imagery. So compare that to, let's see, already at 23 minutes. Okay. Compare that to William Faulkner, let's say. This is from The Sound and the Fury. William Faulkner was certainly an influence on Toni Morrison. I give you the mausoleum of all hopes and desires. I give it to you not that you may remember time, but that you might forget it now, and then for a moment, and not spend all of your breath trying to conquer it. So the very abstract right there. You have that anaphora repetition. Then for a moment, and not spend all of your breath trying to conquer it. So that sort of an anapestic rhythm, not exactly consistent right there. Because no battle is ever won, he said. They're not even fought. The field only reveals to man his own folly and despair, and victory is an illusion of philosophers and fools. So, philosophers and fools, sort of an abstract sort of a reference there, but there's that sort of string of nouns. I keep saying sort of. There's that string of nouns at the end. That's biblical style. Anaphora at the front, string of nouns at the end, repetition of the structure, that sort of parallelism, that repetition of the structure there. But a lot of abstract language, what is really concrete in that particular bit of prose? Mausoleum, maybe. I don't know, what else is concrete in there? Not a whole lot of concrete images in that one. That one had 1,013 likes on Goodreads. For what it's worth, as a direct comparison. As I lay dying, he had a word to, this is a quote from As I Lay Dying, he had a word to love. Some of these have really short lines. I mean, Faulkner's known for his really long lines, so some of these are kind of short lines. He had a word to, period. Love, he called it, period. But I had been used to words for a long time. I knew that, period. I knew that word was like the other's colon, just a shape to fill a lack, semicolon, that when the right time came, you wouldn't need a word for that any more than for pride or fear. So very abstract sort of language right there. One day I was talking to Cora. She prayed for me because she believed I was blind to sin, wanting me to kneel and pray too, because people to whom sin is just a matter of words, to them salvation is just words too. So, very inefficient sort of a phrase. I mean, if I was editing that, not that I deigned to edit Faulkner, but if I was editing that, I would point out, I would say to people, wait, hold on. Some people feel sin is just a matter of words, and sin and salvation are just words. Something like that would be much more efficient. But efficiency is ultimately just irrelevant. It's just trivial. Let me take a look at. Let me do these two, Virginia Woolf. So just comparing, the Toni Morrison lines. Clearly Faulkner's using that sort of biblical style. Virginia Woolf, though, is she really using biblical style? I don't know that she's necessarily all that influenced by biblical style. Southern prose tends to be really heavily influenced by biblical style. So that's sort of where the theory came that she's using that more of a southern sort of prose. I don't know. There may be absolutely nothing to that. Who knows? But yeah, I would say she's using sort of that biblical structure. But Virginia Woolf, another influence, she says, a woman knows very well that though a wit sins, this is from Orlando, I'm using as an influence also for my story, the other ones. A woman knows very well that though a wit sends her his poems, praises her judgment, solicits her criticism, and drinks her tea, this by no means signifies that he respects her opinions, admires her understanding, or will refuse, though the rapier has denied him to run through the body with his pen. So you see, that anaphora, that sort of repetition of structure, really in the middle. Toni Morrison uses that a lot at the beginning, and Faulkner uses that at the beginning of lines. This is just a line where a lot of that repetition really is just right there in the middle. But you see that anaphora, anapest sort of rhythm. So the rapier has denied him to run through the body with his pen, So you have that anapest at the end there. And, a lot of that is really abstract. Again, show don't tell doesn't really apply to that one. Here's one more from Virginia Woolf, and then I'll wrap it up for today. And this one's very, very concrete. This is from The Waves. But that's how, if I think of Virginia Woolf prose, I tend to think you just very, very, very concrete. How much better is silence? The coffee cup, the table. How much better to sit by myself, like the solitary seabird that opens its wings on the stake. Let me sit here forever with bare things. This coffee cup, this knife, this fork, things in themselves, myself being myself. So you have that string of nouns at the end. And it starts off with an abstraction. I think you can look at that one and compare it directly to there's the loneliness that can be wrought. I mean, those two are fairly similar sort of structures. How much better is silence? And then here are all of these concrete images that follow it. What types of loneliness can you experience? Here are these concrete images that follow it. So that this is an ongoing project. So these are just some thoughts, just trying to figure out how, partly to imitate it. I mean, I think that's a valid part of the writing process, to find somebody who's really good at something and imitate them in order to figure out how they're doing it, to see what you can use. And so that's the sort of, I keep saying sort of, that'll be my anaphora. But that's my concept so far. We'll see as I explore further. I'm about to start Home on audiobook, so we'll see. Maybe she changes up completely, and I'm entirely wrong about everything. Who knows? But we will see. See you on the next episode.